Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping into the damp wool, bad rations, and slow-moving misery of the Confederate camps in 1865. Experience the horrors of battle, hunger that never leaves, fevers that don't break, and the kind of medical care that involves a saw and a prayer. Whether you were a fresh recruit, a seasoned officer, or just a guy regretting every life choice that led you to a muddy tent in Virginia, war was out to get you, and it usually did. Take a second to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. Now, settle in, close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. Imagine the chill of a damp Virginia morning, the heavy air settling over camp as you pull on the rough wool of a Confederate uniform. Think you could survive as one of these soldiers? Here's your challenge. Make it through not just your first battle, but the long days and nights where hunger, fever, and exhaustion wait for you in the shadows. Disease often struck before the enemy ever did, creeping through crowded tents and muddy fields, catching men off guard before or after the smoke of battle cleared. Seems simple, right? Think again. Tonight, we'll explore why survival in the Civil War was often a matter of sheer luck, and why so many never made it past their first months in uniform. What if the enemy you never saw was deadlier than the one you faced head-on? Step into the America of the 1860s, and the scale of loss is hard to comprehend. 620,000 soldiers died. Imagine 6 million lives lost today. That number was not just a statistic in a government ledger. It was a reality that touched nearly every family, every town, every street. The war's reach extended far beyond the front lines. It emptied homes, left communities unrecognizable, and changed the country's sense of itself in ways that could not be ignored. This was a war that rewrote the meaning of sacrifice and suffering. The violence of battles like Shiloh, Antietam, Stones River, and Gettysburg stunned the nation. At Gettysburg alone, the casualties in 3 days exceeded the combined American deaths of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. These numbers were not abstract. They were felt in the sudden silences at dinner tables, in the empty pews at church, in the faces of children who would never know their fathers. The devastation was immediate, local, and personal. But the story of death in the Civil War cannot be told through combat alone. The image of soldiers falling in the heat of battle is only part of the truth. For every 3 men killed by bullets or cannon fire, 5 more died from disease, malnutrition, exposure, or complications from wounds. The war was fought as much in muddy camps and makeshift hospitals as on the battlefield. Death moved quietly, often unseen, and it did not discriminate. It crept into tents on the breath of fever, in the water drawn from a polluted stream, or in the cough of a bunkmate. The enemy was not always visible, and the odds of survival depended as much on luck as on bravery. This scale of loss was new to Americans. Before the Civil War, most had only read about distant wars in Europe or heard stories from veterans of earlier conflicts. Now, the violence was here, on familiar ground. Fields once used for farming now turned to graveyards. The American Battlefield Trust describes how the war's destruction forced the nation to confront death on a scale that seemed almost unimaginable. The usual rituals of mourning and burial could not keep up. Families struggled to find and bury their dead. Towns became hospitals overnight. The grief was collective, and it changed the way Americans thought about war forever. Yet even these scenes of battlefield carnage only hint at the true weight of loss. Death in the Civil War was often a private affair, happening far from the roar of cannon or the charge of cavalry. Disease, the great leveler, swept through camps and claimed lives silently. Soldiers never knew when a fever might take hold or when a wound would fester beyond the reach of the day's medicine. In Confederate camps, where food and supplies were scarce, the risk was even higher. Disease did not care about courage or loyalty. It claimed the strong and the weak alike. The lack of preparation for such loss made everything worse. There were no national cemeteries at the start of the war, no organized system for honoring the dead or notifying families. Makeshift graves dotted the countryside, often unmarked and unrecorded. Many families never learned where their loved ones had fallen. The absence of ritual and closure left wounds that would not heal, multiplying the pain of loss. The nation learned, painfully and publicly, how little it was prepared for the scale of its own suffering. The numbers themselves can seem almost beyond belief. 620,000 dead, thousands more missing, their names lost to history, countless others wounded, maimed, or left with injuries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll was just as great. Soldiers who survived often carried invisible scars, what we now call PTSD, but then was simply a silent burden. The war did not end for them when the guns fell silent. It lingered in memory, in nightmares, in the slow recovery of shattered bodies and minds. Prisoner of war camps added another layer to the tragedy. Both Union and Confederate camps became places of misery and death. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of food turned these camps into breeding grounds for disease. Historians note that Vietnam had about 58,000 U.S. deaths. Civil War prisons saw tens of thousands die, a scale still debated by scholars but undeniably horrific. For many, survival in these camps was a matter of chance rather than endurance. Despite the enormity of the loss, the records are incomplete. Casualty lists were often hastily compiled, especially after chaotic battles or in remote skirmishes. Some soldiers simply vanished, their fates unknown to this day. The chaos of war made it impossible to account for everyone. The real toll may be even higher than the numbers suggest. The Civil War's impact did not end with the signing of a treaty or the return of soldiers to their homes. The war left deep scars on the nation's conscience. It changed the way Americans thought about life and death, about sacrifice and community. The creation of national cemeteries after the war was one attempt to bring order and meaning to the chaos. These cemeteries became places of memory and mourning, reminders of how much had been lost and how much the country had endured. For Confederate soldiers, the struggle was especially grim. Poor food, inadequate shelter, and limited medical care made every day a test of endurance. Disease was not just a threat, it was a daily reality. The camps themselves often became places of suffering, where men battled hunger, exposure, and illness as much as the enemy. The war's violence was constant, but the slow, grinding toll of disease was relentless. The Civil War stands as the bloodiest conflict in American history, not just because of the battles, but because of the conditions that followed men wherever they went. It forced the country to reckon with the limits of its own resilience. The war's legacy is not just in the numbers of dead, but in the way those losses reshaped families, communities, and the nation as a whole. Understanding the true scale of death in the Civil War means looking beyond the battlefield. It means recognizing that the greatest threats often came not from the enemy's guns, but from within the ranks, from the water they drank, the food they ate, and the air they breathed. The war's deadliest foe was often invisible, and its effects lingered long after the last shot was fired. For those who lived through it, survival was never guaranteed. The odds were stacked against them, not just by the enemy's fire, but by the world they inhabited every day. The story of the Civil War is not just one of heroism in battle, but of endurance in the face of overwhelming loss. The numbers tell only part of the story. The rest is written in the lives changed, the families broken, and the nation transformed. As we look back on those years, it becomes clear that the greatest danger often waited far from the noise of battle. The true scale of death in the Civil War was measured not just in bodies on the field, but in the quiet suffering of those who never saw combat, who died in camps and hospitals, who faced an enemy they could not see. Survival depended on more than courage or skill. It depended on avoiding the silent threats that lurked in every corner of camp life. Disease did not simply haunt the margins of Civil War life. It was a constant, unrelenting presence in every camp and along every march. The numbers alone are sobering. For every 3 soldiers killed in battle, 5 more died from illness. It's a ratio that refuses to fade into the background, a reminder that the most lethal enemy was not always across the field, but often within the ranks themselves. Survival in the Confederate Army meant facing a war of attrition against invisible foes. Dysentery, typhoid, measles, each one as capable of emptying a regiment as a volley of musket fire. Picture a Confederate camp as dusk settles. Hundreds of men cluster together beneath canvas and rough-hewn lean-tos, the ground beneath them churned to mud by boots and rain. The air is heavy with the scent of sweat and decay, a single latrine dug too close to the water source. Water, drawn from a nearby stream, glimmers in the fading light, seemingly harmless, but carrying with it dangers no one can see. Dysentery moves swiftly through these camps. As the medical and surgical history records, dysentery could kill a soldier within days. Men would grow weak, sunken-eyed, unable to stand, their bodies racked by fever and dehydration. The disease did not linger politely at the camp's edge. It swept through tents, leaving silence in its wake. Typhoid fever followed a similar path, marked by high fevers, chills, and delirium. Soldiers shared everything: blankets, utensils, water cups. Each item passed from hand to hand became a potential vector. The source of these illnesses remained a mystery to most. Germ theory, the understanding that diseases spread through microscopic organisms, was not widely accepted even by war's end. Doctors, working under the old belief that bad air or miasmas cause sickness, rarely washed their hands or sterilized instruments. In the crowded makeshift hospitals of the Confederacy, the smallest cut could become a death sentence, not from the wound itself, but from the infection that followed. Measles, too, found fertile ground among young Confederate soldiers, many of whom had never lived in close quarters before. What began as a rash and a mild fever could quickly spiral into pneumonia or other complications, especially for those already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Dr. Margaret Humphreys, who has studied the social factors behind Civil War mortality, notes that these patterns, one illness opening the door to another, were shaped by more than just exposure. Access to food, clean water, And nursing care made all the difference. Confederate camps, often cut off from supply lines, offered little of any of these. The South struggled to feed and supply its armies made everything worse. Hardtack and salt pork, the staples of a soldier's diet, could fill a stomach but not nourish a body. Fresh fruits and vegetables became rare, and without them, men suffered from scurvy, swollen gums, aching joints, and wounds that refused to heal became familiar complaints. The body, deprived of vitamin C and other nutrients, lost its ability to fight infection. The medical and surgical history describes cases where soldiers' legs broke out in ulcers that would not close, the flesh soft and slow to mend. Malnutrition eroded the line between sickness and health, making every man more vulnerable. Confederate medical staff faced the war with almost nothing. Medicines like quinine, crucial for treating malaria and other fevers, ran out as blockades choked off the South's supply routes. Bandages were made from whatever cloth could be found: shirts, sheets, even curtains. None of it was sterile. Dirt and sweat clung to every scrap, and when these makeshift dressings were pressed to wounds, they often delivered bacteria straight into the bloodstream. The medical and surgical history is filled with accounts of entire wards overtaken by infection, where the air itself seemed heavy with the threat of death. Letters home reveal the personal toll this took. Confederate General Paul Semps wrote of his own ordeal after being wounded at Gettysburg, describing a 60-mile journey in an ambulance over rough roads. The pain and exhaustion are clear in his words. He longed for news from home and for the comfort of family, but what he found instead was a hospital filled with the dying. Soldiers lay side by side on straw pallets, some with festering wounds, others shivering with fever. There was little anyone could do but wait and hope. Disease did not discriminate. It crept into every corner of camp life. Mothers sent desperate letters warning their sons not to drink from streams, but water was scarce and thirst unrelenting. Fathers urged their boys to avoid the sick, but in a world where everyone lived shoulder to shoulder, that was impossible. The simple acts of eating, sleeping, and sharing warmth became dangerous. The roll of the dice was constant. Every cough, every sip, every handshake, another chance for sickness to strike. The South's losses to disease were staggering. Nearly 17% of Confederate soldiers died from illness, a figure that dwarfs the casualties of many battles. The numbers are not just statistics. They represent men who never saw the enemy's face, who fell quietly in their tents or on the march. For every story of battlefield heroism, there are dozens more of men who faded away, their names remembered only in the letters they left behind. What made this suffering even more tragic was that so much of it could have been prevented. Today, we know that boiling water, washing hands, and keeping wounds clean can stop the spread of infection. In the 1860s, this knowledge was still out of reach. The mysteries of disease seemed almost magical, beyond the understanding of doctors and soldiers alike. The simplest precautions were unknown, and the price for that ignorance was paid in lives. The impact on the war itself was profound. Sick men could not fight, march, or hold a line. Commanders watched their units shrink, not from enemy fire, but from the relentless attrition of disease. The Confederacy, already stretched thin, found itself unable to replace the men it lost to fever and infection. The war was fought not just on the battlefield, but in the camps and hospitals, where the real enemy was often unseen. As the months dragged on, the distinction between battle and illness blurred. Soldiers who survived one threat often fell to the other. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion documents case after case where a man wounded in the field succumbed not to his injuries, but to the infection that followed. The tools of war, bullets, bayonets, cannonballs, were only the beginning. The real struggle came afterward, in the slow, uncertain fight against disease. The story of disease in the Confederate ranks is not just a footnote to the war. It is central to understanding why so many never returned home, why families waited for letters that never came, and why the South struggled to keep its armies intact. Each camp became a crossroads, where the fate of a soldier hinged on forces he could not see or control. And so, as the war ground on, disease continued its silent campaign. The men who survived did so by luck as much as by strength. Many, weakened by hunger and illness, found themselves facing yet another trial, one that would test not only their bodies, but their very will to live. The camps emptied, but the wounded remained, waiting for help that often came too late. In these desperate moments, the true horror of Civil War medicine would reveal itself. The story of battlefield medicine in the Civil War is not one of quiet recovery or gentle healing. It is a story told in blood, grit, and the relentless sound of saws at work. Imagine the aftermath of a battle. The smoke has drifted away, but the ground is scattered with wounded men, some crying out, others silent, all waiting for help that may not come soon enough. There are no clean hospital wards, no white-coated doctors. Instead, there are barns with hay for beds, tents crowded with the injured, and surgeons who are little more than mechanics working in a world without understanding of the dangers they face. Medical care in these moments was less a science than an act of desperation. Surgeons moved from one patient to the next, their hands and tools slick with blood. They had no reason to pause and clean their instruments. The idea that invisible germs could spread disease was decades away from acceptance. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, an exhaustive record of these times, describes case after case where infection followed injury not because of bad luck, but because no one knew any better. The air in these makeshift hospitals was thick with the smell of iron and decay. The wounded lay side by side, sometimes on straw, sometimes on the bare floor, waiting for their turn under the knife. Amputation was the most common solution for wounds to arms or legs. Surgeons could remove a limb in under 10 minutes using bone saws, often without anesthesia. Ether and chloroform were available, but in short supply, especially in the South. Many soldiers faced the saw awake, biting down on leather or wood, their shouts echoing through the tent. The priority was speed. The faster the surgery, the better the odds that shock or blood loss would not claim the patient before infection could. But infection almost always followed. The same saw was used for patient after patient, the same blood-stained apron worn all day. There was no washing of hands, no boiling of instruments. The results were predictable: gangrene, blood poisoning, and death. The medical and surgical history is filled with stories that seem almost impossible to imagine now. One Confederate soldier, wounded at Shiloh, was carried to a barn where the floor was already sticky with blood. The surgeon, his sleeves rolled up, worked through the night. Limbs piled up outside the door, a grim testament to the price of survival. Inside, the wounded waited, listening to the rhythm of the saw. knowing that their turn would come soon enough. Some survived, but many did not. Infection moved faster than hope. General Paul Semmes of Georgia left behind a letter that brings these realities into sharp focus. After being wounded at Gettysburg, he wrote, "I was wounded in the leg, but stopped the flow of blood in the field by a tourniquet, applied by myself, and drawn by one of my men of the 10th Ga, and lost but little blood." Semmes made it off the field, but the journey that followed was long and painful. He was carried 60 miles in an ambulance over rough roads, each jolt a reminder of his wound. Despite his efforts, and those of the surgeons who treated him, infection set in. He died the next day, his letter becoming a final message to those waiting at home. His story is not unique. Thousands of soldiers tried to save themselves, only to find that the real enemy was not the bullet, but what came after. The environment in which these men were treated only made things worse. Hospitals were thrown together from whatever was at hand. Sometimes it was a church, sometimes a barn, sometimes just a patch of ground with a canvas overhead. The air was thick, the beds few, and the wounded many. The cries of men in pain filled the night, and the smell of rot and disinfectant, when it could be found, hung in the air. Surgeons worked through exhaustion, their hands shaking, their eyes red from lack of sleep. The medical and surgical history records their names, their successes, and their failures. Each case is a reminder of the limits of what could be done. Survival often depended on luck. A wound that might have healed cleanly in a modern hospital became a death sentence in the field. Even a minor cut could turn deadly if infection set in. There were no antibiotics, no sterile bandages. Water for washing was scarce and often contaminated. The tools of the trade, forceps, knives, saws, were used again and again, never cleaned, never sterilized. The idea that cleanliness could save lives was not yet part of medical thinking. The result was a wave of deaths, not from the enemy's guns, but from the invisible world that no one understood. The impact of this primitive medicine was felt far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers who survived amputations faced a lifetime of pain and disability. Wooden crutches and simple prosthetics became part of daily life. Families struggled to care for men who could no longer work, who carried the marks of war in every movement. Communities changed as well. The sight of men missing arms or legs was common, a reminder of what the war had cost. The burden did not fall on the wounded alone. It spread to everyone who knew them. For the Confederate Army, the shortage of supplies made everything worse. Medicines ran out, bandages were made from torn sheets, and food was often little more than hardtack and salt pork. Malnutrition weakened men before they ever saw battle. When they were wounded, their bodies had little strength left to fight infection. The medical and surgical history notes that even the best surgeons could do little with what they had. The war created a cycle of suffering that no one was prepared to break. Surgeons themselves bore the weight of what they saw. Day after day, they moved from one patient to the next, knowing that most would not survive. They kept records, wrote letters, and tried to make sense of the chaos. Some found ways to cope, others did not. The war changed them as much as it changed the men they treated. Their names appear in the medical and surgical history, attached to cases that are as much about failure as about hope. Each entry is a window into a world where medicine was a last resort, not a guarantee. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of learning. The sheer scale of suffering forced doctors to look for patterns, to ask why some men lived and others died. By the end of the war, some began to suspect that cleanliness mattered, that wounds needed more than speed and luck. These early insights would become the foundation for modern medicine, but for most soldiers, the change came too late. The horror stories of Civil War medicine are not just about pain and loss. They are about what it means to survive in a world that does not yet understand how to heal. They are about the choices made in the heat of battle, the risks taken, and the price paid. They are about the letters written home, the words that tried to capture what could not be said aloud. Every discarded limb, every blood-stained table, every exhausted surgeon is part of a story that is still being told. If you want to understand the true cost of this war, you have to look beyond the numbers. You have to listen to the voices that remain, the words of the wounded, the notes of the surgeons, the messages sent home in trembling hands. These are the records that tell us what it was like, not just to fight, but to try to live through what came after. The next chapter of this story is not written in medical reports or casualty lists, but in the letters carried across battlefields and through the long nights that followed. For the men who found themselves wounded and waiting in makeshift hospitals, the urge to reach out to loved ones became a final act of will. Letters from the front, written in the dim glow of lanterns or by daylight filtering through canvas, capture the private realities of war in a way that no official document ever could. These were not just messages. They were lifelines, sometimes the last words a family would ever receive. Consider the letter written by Confederate Brigadier General Paul Semmes after he was mortally wounded at Gettysburg. His words, set down in a Virginia hospital on July 9th, 1863, offer a rare and unfiltered glimpse into the mind of a man facing the end. I was wounded in the leg, but stopped the flow of blood in the field by a tourniquet applied by myself and drawn by one of my men of the 10th Gaw, and lost but little blood. The language is almost clinical, as if he's reporting on someone else's injury, but beneath it lies a quiet urgency. Semmes's account of applying his own tourniquet with the help of a comrade reveals not just resourcefulness, but the stark reality that soldiers often had to rely on one another and themselves when medical help was slow or uncertain. Within a few lines, the letter shifts. Semmes lists the names of fellow officers who have been killed. Coleman, Lee Chambers, H.D., killed, Jack Jones, kill, and a long list. There's no elaboration, no space for reflection, just names, cut short, the losses stacking up in his mind as quickly as they're written. The brevity is striking. These were men he knew, men he led, and now, with his own fate uncertain, he marks their passing in a handful of words. The emotional weight is left to hang in the silence between sentences. Semmes also tries to offer reassurance to his wife, even as he faces the growing possibility that he will not recover. I telegraphed you 3-day, seriously wounded, main danger over, stay at home, will write. The tension in these lines is unmistakable. He wants to protect her from the worst, to hold back the truth for just a little longer. The act of writing in this moment is not just about conveying facts, but about shielding loved ones from pain, even as his own increases. The letter becomes a balancing act between honesty and hope. The physical act of writing such a letter was itself a struggle. Semmes's handwriting, according to those who have seen the original, grew shaky and uneven as his strength faded. Picture him, propped up in a crowded ward, the sounds of other wounded men all around, forcing his hand to steady long enough to put his thoughts on paper. There are no grand farewells or flowery sentiments, just the bare essentials, the things that must be said before time runs out. In that restraint, we sense both the exhaustion of his body and the determination of his spirit. Letters like Semmis's did not travel alone. Across the South, scraps of paper passed from hand to hand, from muddy camps to anxious homes, each one carrying a unique mixture of fear, hope, and longing. For many Confederate soldiers, writing home was a daily ritual, a way to maintain a fragile thread of connection to the world they had left behind. The act of putting pen to paper became a form of resistance against the isolation and uncertainty of war. These letters reveal more than just the facts of injury and loss. They open a window onto the emotional landscape of the men who wrote them. Far from the stoic image often associated with soldiers, the words are filled with doubt, regret, and an aching sense of absence. Semmis's letter contains no mention of glory or victory. Instead, it circles around the need to reassure, to remember fallen friends, and to reach across the distance to his wife. In this, he was not unique. Countless letters from the front are marked by the same quiet yearning, the same effort to say what matters most when time is short. For the families who received these letters, the impact was profound. Often, the letter arrived after the man who wrote it had already died. There was no body, no funeral, only the words left behind. A wife or mother might hold the letter for years, reading and rereading the lines, searching for comfort or meaning. The letter became a stand-in for the man himself, the last tangible link to a life cut short. This was the reality for thousands of families. News of death delivered not by official notice, but by the hand of the dead themselves. Communication during the war was slow and unreliable. A letter might take weeks or even months to reach its destination, delayed by the movement of armies, the destruction of rail lines, or the chaos of battle. Soldiers often wrote with the knowledge that their words might never make it home, or that, by the time they did, everything would have changed. The uncertainty added another layer of strain to already frayed nerves. For those waiting at home, every letter was both a blessing and a source of dread. The letters also speak to the camaraderie and mutual support that developed among soldiers. Semmis's brief mention of the help he received from one of my men is echoed in countless other letters. In the face of constant danger and deprivation, these bonds became essential. Men relied on each other not just for physical survival, but for emotional endurance. The letters sometimes mention shared meals, small acts of kindness, or the simple comfort of a familiar voice. These details remind us that, even in the bleakest circumstances, people found ways to care for one another. At the same time, the letters lay bare the limits of what could be done. Medical care was primitive, and even minor wounds could turn deadly. Soldiers wrote about fevers that would not break, wounds that refused to heal, and the slow realization that hope was slipping away. The awareness of their own mortality is often present, sometimes stated plainly, sometimes hidden between the lines. Yet still, they wrote, choosing to spend their last moments not in bitterness, but in an effort to connect. Institutions like the Gilder Lehrman Institute preserve these letters, allowing us to read the actual words and feel the emotional undercurrents that run through them. The handwriting, the choice of words, the pauses, and unfinished thoughts all offer clues to the state of mind of the writer. These documents transform soldiers from anonymous casualties into individuals with families, fears, and unfinished stories. The emotional complexity of these letters is striking. They are not simply accounts of suffering, but attempts to make sense of it. Some letters try to offer comfort. Tell the children I love them. Others ask for forgiveness or express regrets about things left undone. The tone can shift from hopeful to resigned in the space of a few lines. In Semmes' case, the effort to protect his wife from the worst of the truth is a final act of love, even as he faces the end. For many, these written words became the only legacy left behind. The absence of formal rituals, no polished casket, no graveside gathering, meant that the letter itself took on a sacred quality. Families stored them in Bibles, tucked them away in drawers, or carried them folded in pockets. The letter became a source of comfort, a way to keep the memory of the lost alive. Yet it also served as a reminder of the distance that war imposed, the conversations that would never happen, the futures that would remain unfinished. Reading these letters today, we are reminded that the Civil War's toll was not just measured in battles won or lost, but in the quiet moments of fear and longing that played out in tents and hospitals across the country. The suffering was not confined to the battlefield. It seeped into homes, shaping the lives of those who waited and those who never returned. The personal cost of war is written in these lines, in the careful words of a husband to his wife, in the names of friends lost, in the hope that somehow a message will reach its destination. The question lingers: what would you say if your final words were all your family would ever hear? And while these letters give us a glimpse of the heartache and resilience of those who endured, they also hint at the many other hardships Confederate soldiers faced. In the coming days, as the letters faded and the pain lingered, another silent threat began to shape the fate of the men in gray. One that started not with bullets or fever, but with the simple ache of an empty stomach. Malnutrition was a constant, silent threat for Confederate soldiers, shaping their daily existence in ways that are often overlooked. The war's battles may have been decided by guns and bayonets, but the struggle for food determined whether a man could even stand in line, let alone fight. For many, the day began and ended with hunger. The air might have been heavy with the smell of damp earth or the distant smoke of a campfire, but the thought that pressed in most urgently was about food, what little there was, and how long it might last. The Confederate diet was meager and monotonous. Jaw-breaking hardtack soaked in water was all some men had, sometimes accompanied by a scrap of salted pork or a handful of cornmeal. There was no variety, and rarely enough to go around. The South's fields, once rich with crops, had been turned over to cotton in the years before the war. Cotton exports starved their own fields, leaving little for troops. When the war came, the South's agricultural focus on cash crops meant there simply wasn't enough food to feed both the army and the people at home. Even the food that did reach the camps was hardly enough to keep a man healthy. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare. Meat and dairy, when available, were quickly rationed out and gone. The result was a diet stripped of essential vitamins and minerals. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, became a common enemy. Soldiers' gums swelled and bled. Their joints ached, and wounds that might have healed cleanly instead became slow to close, sometimes festering for weeks. The symptoms were unmistakable, and the cause was as clear as the empty mess tins that clattered around camp. Union forces understood the power of hunger. They targeted railways, bridges, and supply depots, making it nearly impossible for Confederate supply lines to function. The South's infrastructure was already fragile, and it simply could not withstand the pressure. Food that might have reached the front lines was stranded miles away or destroyed before it could be distributed. As the war dragged on, Confederate soldiers found themselves cut off from even the most basic rations. In remote camps, resupply became a distant hope. Days would pass with nothing but hardtack and a few spoonfuls of cornmeal. Foraging became a necessity. Soldiers scoured the countryside for anything edible: wild berries, roots, stray livestock, even scraps left behind by retreating armies. Some units sent out small groups to hunt or gather, but the land itself was quickly stripped bare by the constant demands of thousands of hungry men. The effects of malnutrition were not limited to a hollow stomach. Hunger weakened bodies and minds alike. A soldier, already worn thin by months of poor diet, was far more likely to fall ill. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and measles swept through camps, feeding on weakened immune systems. The body's defenses were down, and there was little a doctor could do but watch. Even minor wounds became deadly when the body lacked the strength to heal. A cut or scrape could fester into a life-threatening infection. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion is filled with cases where the true cause of death was not the original wound, but the slow, invisible drain of malnutrition. The physical toll was matched by a decline in morale. Hunger gnawed at a man's resolve. It made every task harder: marching, fighting, even standing guard. Exhaustion set in quickly when there was nothing to fuel the body. The mind, too, became clouded by constant hunger. Soldiers found it difficult to focus, their thoughts drifting back to home and the meals they remembered. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as men grew desperate. Desertion rates rose. Some left their posts, driven not by fear of the enemy, but by the simple need to find food. For many, the hope of a full meal outweighed the call of duty. The lines between right and wrong blurred when survival was at stake. The impact of malnutrition reached beyond the battlefield. Civilian families in the South faced their own struggles. Farms were caught in the crossfire, their crops seized by both Confederate and Union forces. Women and children went hungry as food was diverted to the army or taken by raiding parties. The collapse of the South's agricultural system meant that hunger was not just a soldier's problem. It was a fact of life for everyone. The hardship was shared, and the consequences rippled out in every direction. Stories from the front lines and from home paint a picture of desperation. Soldiers wrote home about empty mess kits and the constant ache in their bellies. Letters describe men trading scraps of food, sharing whatever they could find, and the quiet despair that came when there was nothing left to share. Some tried to supplement their rations by foraging, but the land could only give so much. Wild game and edible plants were quickly hunted out. Even in the best of times, the South's countryside could not support the demands of two armies and a civilian population. As the war wore on, the gap between need and supply grew wider. The lack of proper nutrition affected every aspect of military life. A man weakened by hunger could not march as far or fight as hard. Battles were lost not just because of tactics or weapons, but because the men holding the line were simply too weak to keep going. Commanders reported units arriving late, moving slowly, or failing to hold their ground, all traced back to the simple fact that their soldiers were starving. The disparity between North and South became stark. Union soldiers, while not immune to hardship, generally had better access to food. Their supply lines, though stretched at times, were rarely as fragile as those of the Confederacy. The difference was visible in the men themselves. By the end of the war, observers described Confederate soldiers as gaunt, hollow-eyed, and barely able to stand. Malnutrition also shaped the medical story of the war. Wounded men, who might have survived with better care, often died because their bodies could not recover. The lack of nutrients meant that wounds healed slowly, if at all. Infection set in easily, and there was little the surgeons could do. The cycle was vicious. Hunger made illness more likely, and illness made hunger harder to bear. The suffering was quiet, but it was everywhere. The psychological strain of constant hunger cannot be overstated. The daily battle for food wore down even the most determined soldiers. Hope faded with each missed meal. The knowledge that tomorrow would bring no relief made it hard to keep going. Some men gave up, slipping away in the night in search of food, or simply refusing to fight any longer. Hunger was a quiet enemy, but it was relentless. The story of malnutrition in the Confederate Army is not just a footnote to the war. It is central to understanding why so many men died, why the South's armies grew weaker, and why the war ended as it did. The focus on battles and strategy often overshadows the daily struggle for survival. Yet it was this struggle, played out in every camp, along every road, and in every home, that shaped the outcome of the war as much as any general's plan. The true cost of malnutrition is hard to measure. Deaths from hunger were rarely recorded as such. Most were listed under disease, wounds, or simply unknown causes. The numbers blur together, making it difficult to say how many men were lost to hunger alone. But the evidence is everywhere. In the letters home, in the reports of commanders, in the memories of those who survived. Hunger left its mark on every man who fought, and on the South itself. As the war dragged on, the effects of malnutrition became impossible to ignore. The armies grew smaller, the men weaker, the hope of victory more distant. By the time of surrender, many Confederate soldiers were little more than shadows of their former selves. The war had taken everything from them, including the strength to carry on. And so, as we try to understand the true toll of the Civil War, we must look beyond the battlefield, beyond the lists of dead and wounded, to the quieter stories of hunger and deprivation. These stories remind us that the cost of war is not always found in the clash of armies, but in the slow, steady erosion of strength and spirit. The numbers we use to measure loss may never tell the whole story. There are gaps, places where the suffering cannot be counted, only remembered. In the end, we are left asking, how can we know the full price if so much of it is hidden from view? The task of counting the Civil War's dead is far from straightforward. The numbers we often recite, 620,000, sometimes 750,000, rest on a foundation that is anything but solid. The very process of recording loss, of turning lives into lists and tallies, was shaped by the confusion, urgency, and disorder of the time. For those who try to understand the true scale of the war's destruction, the incomplete nature of the records is not just a frustration, it is a central part of the story itself. During the Civil War, the systems for tracking soldiers and casualties were makeshift at best. Most of what we know begins with three main kinds of records: enlistment rolls, muster rolls, and casualty lists. Each was meant to capture a different aspect of the Army's life and death, but each was also vulnerable to error, loss, and neglect. Enlistment rolls, created as men signed up in cities and towns, were supposed to offer a full accounting of who served. Yet only those from larger northern cities were reliably preserved. In the Confederacy, the situation was worse. Many southern towns lacked not just the resources, but even the basic infrastructure to keep records safe. Fires, floods, hurried retreats, and the simple passage of time erased names before they could be counted. The gaps are especially wide for Confederate soldiers, whose enlistment records often vanished with the towns and counties that created them. Muster rolls, which officers compiled every few months, were intended to show who was present and who was missing. But these documents were not immune to the chaos of war. Names were misspelled, details were left out or guessed, and the rolls themselves were sometimes lost or ruined in the field. A single clerical error could erase a man from history, and many documents simply disappeared in the shuffle of movement and combat. The result is a patchwork of partial accounts, with whole units sometimes appearing or vanishing from the record with little explanation. Casualty lists, assembled in the days after battles, are perhaps the most haunting records of all. Officers tried to account for the living and the dead, but exhaustion and confusion clouded their efforts. Men who were wounded, missing, or captured could be misclassified, and the fate of many was never clearly recorded. The term missing might mean anything: a soldier killed and left on the field, a man taken prisoner, or someone who deserted. For the families waiting at home, and for us looking back, these lists are a reminder of how quickly a life could slip into obscurity. Even the most ambitious attempts to bring order to this chaos fell short. The official records of the Union and Confederate armies, an immense collection of some 138,000 pages, remains the most comprehensive source for Civil War land warfare. Yet even this monumental effort, begun after the war and compiled from whatever could be gathered, is marked by inconsistencies. Many records were reconstructed from memory, sometimes years after the fact. Others were copied and recopied, introducing errors along the way. Some veterans, eager to shape their own legacy, made changes that suited their reputations. The result is a vast archive that is both indispensable and deeply flawed. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion adds another layer, offering detailed accounts of wounds, diseases, and deaths. This work, drawn mostly from Union medical records, provides a window into the suffering that followed soldiers off the battlefield and into crowded hospitals. But even here, the numbers are incomplete. Confederate medical data was often missing or fragmentary, leaving large blind spots in the record. The American Battlefield Trust and other organizations have spent years trying to piece together these scattered fragments. Their efforts reveal just how elusive a definitive count remains, especially for the Confederate side. The collapse of the Southern government meant that many records were lost, destroyed, or never created at all. After the fall of Richmond, Union officials tried to salvage what they could, but the archives they found were already in disarray. For historians, The task is less about finding a final answer and more about understanding the limits of what can be known. The debate over numbers continues to this day. The figure of 620,000 Civil War deaths has long been accepted, but some scholars now argue the true toll could be as high as 750,000. These higher estimates reflect new methods, such as demographic analysis and comparisons with census data, but they remain contested. The truth may never be known. What is clear is that every number is an approximation, an attempt to measure the immeasurable. Consider the soldiers who never made it into any official record. Some joined hastily formed militia units, others fought in irregular commands, and many slipped away before their names could be written down. Their service and their deaths are missing from the lists. For these men, the war ended not with a formal notice, but in silence. Each unrecorded life is a reminder that the war's impact stretched far beyond what can be counted. Errors in the records themselves further complicate the picture. Officers sometimes wrote names phonetically, especially for men with foreign or unusual surnames. The same soldier might appear under several different spellings, or vanish from the rolls entirely due to a single mistake. Multiply this by the thousands of men who served, and the scale of the problem becomes clear. Union records, though better preserved, were not immune to these flaws. The sheer number of soldiers, the constant movement of armies, and the pressures of battle all contributed to a system riddled with gaps and contradictions. The story grows even more complex when we consider those who died after the fighting stopped. Many soldiers survived their wounds or illnesses only to die months or years later from complications. Tuberculosis, infections, and lingering injuries claimed lives long after the war's official end. These deaths rarely made it into the regimental records. The war's shadow stretched on, uncounted. Prison camps add another dimension to the uncertainty. Places like Andersonville and Elmira became notorious for their high death rates, yet even here, the records are incomplete. Some prisoners died and were buried in mass graves, their names lost forever. Others were released in poor health, only to die soon after returning home. The official lists tell only part of the story. The rest is hidden in the memories of survivors and the silence of the dead. On the battlefield itself, the problem of missing soldiers was ever present. In the confusion of retreat and pursuit, many bodies were left unburied or buried without identification. Years later, recovery teams sometimes found remains scattered and anonymous. These men, too, are absent from the tallies. All of this uncertainty shapes how we remember the Civil War. Numbers have a way of making tragedy feel manageable, as if the scale of loss can be contained in a single figure. But when we recognize how incomplete those numbers are, we are forced to confront the full depth of the war's devastation. Every missing name is a person who lived, fought, and died. Someone whose story ended without a record. Despite these challenges, the work to reconstruct the past continues. Historians, archivists, and volunteers sift through what remains, comparing rolls, letters, and reports. Their efforts help us see the war not just as a series of battles, but as a collection of lives interrupted and stories unfinished. The gaps in the record are not just obstacles. They are reminders of the scale and complexity of the past. The incomplete picture left by Civil War records is not a flaw to be corrected, but a truth to be acknowledged. The war was chaotic, its aftermath even more so. The records reflect that reality, imperfect, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory. And yet, In their very imperfection, they offer a kind of honesty about the nature of war and memory. Some of the most important lessons from the Civil War come not from what was recorded, but from what was lost. The missing names, the unknown graves, the families who never received word, all of these speak to the limits of our ability to measure loss. This uncertainty forces us to remember each soldier as more than a number. As we look more closely at who was counted and who was not, another layer of the story emerges. The experience of war was not the same for every soldier. Differences in background, circumstance, and opportunity shaped who survived and who did not. Some faced obstacles that went far beyond bullets and disease, raising new questions about the meaning of survival itself. The Civil War's story of loss and endurance is incomplete without reckoning with the role of race in survival. For Black soldiers in the Union Army, the war was not just a fight for freedom or country. It was a daily struggle against the weight of inequality. The numbers alone speak volumes. Black soldiers were 3 times more likely to die from disease than their white counterparts, a 3-to-1 ratio that cannot be explained by chance or fate. This stark disparity was woven into every part of their military experience, from the food they ate to the care they received when illness struck. Nearly 180,000 Black men served in the Union Army, making up about 1/10 of its total forces. They stood in ranks, shouldered rifles, and marched into battle. But their greatest enemy often came not from across the field, but from within their own camps. Disease swept through Black regiments with a ferocity unmatched elsewhere. The reasons for this were not mysterious. They were rooted in the daily realities of Army life and in the deeper structures of racism that shaped the Union's war effort. Nutrition was the first line of defense against illness, and here, Black soldiers were set up to fail. Rations were never generous for anyone, but for Black units, what little arrived was often of even lower quality and smaller quantity. Her studies show Black units received poorer rations and fewer nurses, a fatal combination. Dr. Margaret Humphreys, who has studied the health of Civil War soldiers, points to the social determinants that made the difference between life and death. The men in Black regiments received less meat, fewer vegetables, and almost none of the fresh food needed to stave off diseases like scurvy. When supplies ran low, Black units were among the last to be resupplied. The system was stacked so that the newest, least powerful members of the Army bore the brunt of its shortages. Hunger was not the only hardship. Black soldiers were often assigned to the most punishing forms of labor. Digging trenches became a daily reality, grueling work that drained strength and left men exhausted. The logic was circular. Officers claimed Black troops were suited for hard labor, then used their exhaustion and illness as proof of their supposed inferiority. The result was predictable. Men weakened by relentless digging, on poor food, and with little rest, fell ill in droves. Fevers, coughs, and stomach ailments spread quickly, finding easy targets in bodies already worn down. Camp conditions made things worse. Field sanitation was poor everywhere, but Black encampments were often the most neglected. Latrines, when dug, were sometimes placed too close to tents, contaminating water and air. With little oversight and few resources, these camps became breeding grounds for disease. The smallest mistake, a misplaced latrine, spoiled food, a stagnant puddle, could lead to an outbreak that swept through a regiment in days. For Black soldiers, The margin for error was almost non-existent. When illness struck, the differences in care became even more pronounced. Medical attention was rationed, and black soldiers received less of it. Dr. Humphreys's research makes clear that access to nursing was a decisive factor in whether a sick soldier survived. But black regiments were assigned fewer nurses, and those present often had less training or support. The sick were left to fend for themselves, or to rely on fellow soldiers who were just as exhausted and ill. Hospitals, always crowded and underfunded, were worse for black troops. They were sent to separate wards or makeshift facilities where supplies ran out and staff were stretched thin. Even in integrated hospitals, black soldiers found themselves at the back of the line for treatment and medicine. The result was a cascade of suffering. A fever that might have been survivable with rest and care became fatal when ignored or treated too late. Minor wounds, left unattended, turned septic. The most basic comforts, a clean bed, a drink of water, a word of reassurance, were often missing. The death toll rose, not because black soldiers were less resilient, but because the system they served in valued their lives less. The roots of these inequalities ran deep. Many black soldiers had only recently escaped slavery or poverty. Years of deprivation meant they entered the army already weakened, with little resistance to new diseases. The Union Army, eager for manpower but slow to adapt, made few allowances for these realities. Training was rushed, medical screenings were cursory, and the unique risks faced by black troops were ignored. The Army's leaders, shaped by the prejudices of their time, saw black soldiers as expendable labor rather than as men to be protected and cared for. Discrimination followed black soldiers everywhere. It shaped not just their diet and their duties, but the way they were treated when sick or wounded. Officers and doctors, influenced by racist beliefs, often assumed that black soldiers could endure more pain or required less attention. The result was a pattern of neglect that showed itself in every statistic and every story. The exhibit, Fighting for Their Lives, Medical Practices, during the American Civil War, brings these realities into focus, showing the tools and techniques used to treat wounds and illness, and highlighting the stark differences in care. The visual reminders, photographs of overcrowded wards, accounts of desperate nurses, lists of the dead, make it clear that the suffering of black soldiers was not an accident. It was the product of choices made day after day by those in charge. Yet even in the face of these obstacles, black soldiers persisted. They endured hunger, exhaustion, and sickness, holding their ground in battles both seen and unseen. Their service was essential, their courage undeniable. But their survival rates remind us that valor alone was not enough. The difference between life and death often came down to a system that favored some and abandoned others. Their survival wasn't just about valor. It was about enduring a system stacked against them. The story of black soldiers in the Civil War is not just a footnote to the larger story of the conflict. It is a window into the workings of inequality, a reminder that the fight for freedom was never fought on equal terms. The war's records, its rolls, its hospital logs, its letters home, show us the numbers, but they also point to the deeper forces at work. Dr. Humphreys' research and the preserved artifacts and stories in places like the Lopus Gallery offer a fuller picture of what was lost and what was endured. To understand the human cost of the Civil War, we have to look beyond the battles and the generals. We have to see the faces in the camps, the hands digging trenches, the names on the casualty lists. We have to recognize that the suffering of black soldiers was not just a matter of bad luck or poor hygiene, but of a society and an army still divided by race, even as it fought to end slavery. The lessons of their experience do not belong to the past alone. They shape the way we remember the war and the way we understand the country that emerged from it. When we read the statistics, when we look at the faded photographs or the worn uniforms in museum cases, we are called to remember the unequal burdens carried by those who fought. Their stories invite us to reflect, not just on the cost of war, but on the meaning of survival itself. Come, let the weight of their world settle over your shoulders for a moment. History isn't just a record of what happened. It's a map of choices, consequences, and the fragile thread that ties individual lives to the wider story of a nation. The lessons of the Civil War, and especially of the Confederate soldiers' experience, don't emerge from a single statistic or a famous speech. They're found in the details, the names half faded from muster rolls, the hurried notes from a surgeon's tent, the numbers scratched into ledgers by tired clerks. If we look closely, these fragments reveal not only the scale of loss, but the meaning behind it. The human cost of the Civil War is often reduced to numbers: dead, wounded, missing. But each number hides a story. There are the letters written in the dim light of a hospital, the field reports hurriedly recorded as the sun set on another day of fighting, and the hospital logs that quietly track the spread of fever through a crowded camp. These scraps of memory, scattered across time and paper, remind us that the war's true impact was measured not just in battles won or lost, but in the lives changed and the futures cut short. For generations, there's been a temptation to let myth smooth over the rough edges. The image of the Confederate soldier, noble and doomed, has been polished until it gleams, while the mud, blood, and disease that define daily life have faded into the background, yet the records themselves refuse to let us forget. The official records of the Union and Confederate armies, 138,000 pages of reports, orders, and correspondence, offer more than just a timeline of events. Within those pages, you find the exhaustion of officers who could barely keep up with the pace of loss, and the urgency of men who knew that every new engagement would bring more names to add to the casualty lists. The language of the reports is often formal, but beneath it lies a quiet desperation, a sense of trying to impose order on chaos, to make sense of a world that was coming apart. The sheer scale of the official records is staggering, but even this massive archive is incomplete. Confederate documents were especially vulnerable, many lost in the chaos after Richmond's fall. Union efforts to gather what remained were impressive, but the gaps are as telling as the content. Even in the best preserved records, errors and omissions abound, a reflection of the impossibility of capturing every life and every loss in the midst of war. Still, these documents are the backbone of Civil War scholarship. They allow us to trace the arc of battles, but more importantly, to glimpse the human cost that followed in their wake. Inside the official records, Series 1 stands out for its detailed accounts of military operations. The reports are clinical, sometimes even cold, but the numbers they contain demand attention. A single line, wounded 340, hints at hundreds of stories, each one a world unto itself. The language of military bureaucracy can't hide the reality that, for every engagement listed, there were men, who would never return home, families who would never know exactly what happened, and communities left to rebuild with fewer hands. Series 2 and 3 shift the focus to prisoners of war and the machinery needed to keep armies moving. The stories from places like Andersonville are especially sobering. Soldiers didn't die with banners flying. They died slowly, from disease and starvation. Their suffering recorded in brief, matter-of-fact entries. Yet someone took the time to write it down, to mark the passing of each life, even if the larger meaning was elusive. Within these accounts, you sense the struggle to bear witness, to ensure that, even in the worst conditions, the dead would not be entirely forgotten. But the records of battle and logistics only tell part of the story. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. MSHWR brings us even closer to the reality of war. Compiled between 1870 and 1888, this collection doesn't dwell on strategy or tactics. Instead, it offers a brutal, unflinching look at what war did to the human body. Tens of thousands of surgical cases are detailed here, each one a testament to the limits of 19th century medicine and the resilience of those who endured it. The MSHWR is filled with images, drawings of amputated limbs, tables of infection rates, and photographs of wounded men that force us to confront the cost of survival. One fact from the MSHWR stands out. It documents more than 53,000 surgical cases, each one painstakingly recorded. The specificity is relentless. We see not just the wounds, but the aftermath, the infections that set in, the slow decline of men who lingered for weeks or months, and the rare stories of recovery against the odds. The numbers, laid out in neat columns, reveal a war fought as much in hospital tents as on the battlefield. Disease killed more men than bullets, and the suffering endured by those who survived was often hidden from public view. The MSHWR reminds us that the end of battle did not mean the end of pain. These records, both the official records and the MSHWR, do more than preserve facts. They challenge us to look beyond the surface, to resist the urge to see the Civil War as a series of grand events, and instead focus on the everyday realities that shaped it. The preservation of these documents was no accident. It was the result of years of effort, decisions made by people who understood that memory is fragile, and that the stories of the past can vanish if not carefully kept. Their survival carries a responsibility to read them, to remember, and to try to understand what they represent. What do they represent in the end? They are a mirror, reflecting the cost of conflict and the choices that led to it. They show us the limits of what can be known, but also the depth of what can be felt. Studying these records is not just an academic exercise. It's a way of entering into the lives of those who came before, of seeing the world through their eyes, and of recognizing the echoes of their struggles in our own time. The names may be unfamiliar, but the emotions, fear, hope, loss, are universal. The records ask us not just to remember, but to empathize. It's easy, with the distance of years, to let the edges blur. The stories of Confederate soldiers, like those of their Union counterparts, are often retold in ways that emphasize glory or tragedy, depending on the needs of the moment. But the records don't allow for easy answers. They show us the messiness of real lives, the compromises and mistakes, the moments of courage and the depths of suffering. They ask us to look past the myths and see the people underneath. If these stories resonate, consider subscribing to keep uncovering history's hidden truths. Each letter, each report, each case file is a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but about who lived and who was lost. The lessons of the Civil War are not locked away in archives. They're alive in the questions we ask, the stories we tell, and the ways we choose to remember. The Civil War's medical records, in particular, offer a warning. They show how quickly suffering can multiply when systems fail, when resources run short, and when leaders are unprepared for the realities they face. The improvisations of battlefield medicine, the desperate search for supplies, and the slow recognition that old ways would not suffice. All of these have parallels in the crises that follow every war. The innovations that emerged, from new surgical techniques to the first attempts at organized ambulances, were born out of necessity and pain. They remind us that progress often comes at a terrible cost, but perhaps the most enduring lesson is about empathy. The Civil War's records force us to confront uncomfortable truths. That survival often depended on luck, that suffering was not distributed equally, and that the stories we inherit are shaped as much by what is lost as by what is preserved. The numbers matter, but the lives behind them matter more. When we read a casualty list or a hospital log, we are called to remember that each entry was a person, not a statistic, but a son, a brother, a friend. This is why history matters. It's not just about dates and outcomes, but about understanding the world as it was, in all its complexity and pain. The records of the Civil War, imperfect, incomplete, and sometimes contradictory, are a testament to the effort to remember and to the importance of not letting those memories slip away. They remind us that every war leaves scars, not just on the land or in the records, but in the lives of those who survive and those who are left behind. As we reflect on these lessons, we are left with a question that lingers long after the books are closed and the documents put away. When we remember war, do we honor the numbers or the lives behind them? For Confederate soldiers, the greatest threat wasn't the Union soldier, it was the war's relentless cruelty. Disease crept through the camps, silent and unseen. Hunger hollowed out bodies and spirits. Even those who survived carried scars, some visible, many hidden. Day after day, these men fought not just battles, but the grinding struggle to stay alive. The Civil War's legacy is measured in more than casualty lists. It lives in the quiet suffering and endurance of ordinary people. These stories remind us to value peace, to care for one another, and to preserve the truths left behind. If their stories moved you, share this video to help keep their memory alive. Sometimes, all that remains is an empty knapsack by a silent campfire, and the memory we choose to carry forward.